The story begins by painting a vivid picture of a man whose life has been carved out of silence, labor, and grief. The rancher, John McAllister, is a man in his early 40s, but the years weigh heavily upon him. His face is weathered from the sun, his hands calloused from endless toil, and his heart hardened by a past that few know about. 15 years earlier, he had lost the woman he loved. Whether to illness, accident, or circumstance doesn't matter as much as the emptiness it left behind. Since then, his ranch has been more than just a livelihood. It has been his prison and his penance. Every morning begins the same way. John rises before the first streak of light touches the horizon, dresses in silence, and walks out into the cool dawn. The air is crisp, the only sound the lowing of cattle and the distant call of a hawk. His ranch stretches endlessly, a sea of grass and fences with barns and corrals that bear the marks of his unceasing work. He tends to the animals, repairs broken posts, checks the water supply, all by himself. In town, people know him as that quiet rancher, a man who keeps to himself, speaks little, and has no interest in company. Yet beneath his hardened exterior lies a gnawing ache. John has not shared a meal with another person in over a decade. He has not heard laughter within his walls, nor felt the warmth of another hand in his own. His house, though sturdy, is hollow. The wooden floors creak with emptiness. The table is set for one, and the bed he lies in each night feels far too large. Sometimes, when the wind howls across the plains, he swears he can almost hear the ghost of a woman's voice calling his name. But John is not the kind of man to wallow. He buries his loneliness beneath routine. Work is his salvation, sweat his shield. To the outside world, he appears perfectly content, stoic, capable, a man who asks for nothing. Inside, however, he wonders if his life will ever be more than the endless cycle of chores and silence. He has convinced himself that love is for younger men, for those unscarred by loss. Women, he tells himself, have no place in his life anymore. What would he even say to one after so many years? His voice feels rough, his manner blunt. It is easier to avoid the thought altogether. Still, there are small cracks in his armor. Sometimes, when he rides into town for supplies, he catches himself staring too long at the couples walking together or families gathered at the general store. Sometimes, the scent of fresh bread or the sound of a woman's laughter reminds him of what he has lost. And in those rare moments when he allows himself to imagine a different life, he quickly shakes the thought away, retreating once again into the safety of his isolation. This opening sets the stage for the emotional stakes of the story. John is not just lonely, he is a man who has accepted loneliness as his fate. His life is orderly, predictable, and safe, but it is also unbearably empty. The reader is meant to feel both admiration for his resilience and sorrow for his solitude. It has been 15 long years since he last touched a woman. 15 years since his heart dared to hope. 15 years since life offered him more than survival. And it is in this desolate quiet that fate will soon intervene, bringing a woman to his door who will shatter the monotony of his existence and awaken the part of him he thought was long dead. John McAllister's days were as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Routine had become not just his way of life, but his method of survival. After so many years alone, his mind clung to order like a drowning man to driftwood. If he followed the same path each day, there was no room for surprises, no room for disappointment, and certainly no room for heartache. The mornings always began the same. He rose before dawn, washed his face with cold water from a tin basin, and drank a strong cup of coffee that tasted more of bitterness than comfort. Breakfast was usually simple: bread, eggs, sometimes bacon, if he'd had the chance to smoke a slab earlier in the week. He never lingered at the table. Food was fuel, nothing more. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, John was already out with his cattle, moving through the dew-soaked grass with steady, practiced steps. The ranch itself bore witness to his tireless labor. Fences stood straight and strong, barns neatly mended, fields cleared of stones and brush. Every repair carried the mark of his hand alone. Neighbors often commented in town that McAllister's spread was one of the best kept for miles around, though they also whispered it must come at the cost of human connection. A man could mend wood and leather. But what about a man's soul? John never cared to answer that question. His afternoons were spent much the same, tending to the livestock, checking water troughs, training his horses. Sometimes he rode the outer boundary of his land, ensuring no predators had slipped in or that fences hadn't been cut. He found a kind of grim peace in the work. The rhythm of hammering a nail, the creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of cattle. It was the music of his life. But it was also a lonely melody, one without harmony. When he did ride into town once or twice a month, it was purely out of necessity. Supplies ran low, tools needed sharpening, and sometimes he had to sell off cattle or buy new stock. He spoke little at the general store or blacksmith's, answering questions with curt nods. Men respected him, but women pitied him from a distance. Some remembered the man he had once been, full of fire, full of love. Now he was a ghost of that man, still breathing but not truly living. Evenings were the hardest. After the day's work, John returned to a house that felt too quiet, too empty. He'd cook himself supper, usually a stew or beans, and sit at a wooden table built for a family but occupied by one. His late wife's rocking chair sat by the fire, gathering dust. Sometimes he found himself staring at it for long minutes, as though expecting it to move. He never admitted out loud that he still heard her voice in memory. At night, he read by lamplight, mostly newspapers from weeks ago or an old Bible his mother had given him. But the words didn't always sink in. His thoughts drifted instead. To the silence of his bed, the cool sheets beside him that had not known another's warmth in 15 years. He was a man alive in body, but starved in spirit. This unbroken cycle of days paints the picture of a man who has mastered survival but forgotten how to live. His routines shield him from chaos, but they also shield him from joy. The reader can sense that beneath his rigid control lies a deep yearning, one that he refuses to acknowledge yet cannot fully suppress. And it is into this monotonous, carefully ordered existence that fate will soon hurl a spark, breaking the pattern in a way John could never predict. It happened on a day much like any other. John McAllister had ridden into town for supplies, his mind occupied with thoughts of fencing wire, sacks of grain, and the tools he needed to mend a broken gate. His visits to town were practical, never social. He liked to move quickly, nod politely to those who greeted him, and return home before nightfall. Yet on this particular day, something unexpected awaited him at the post office. The postmaster, a plump, cheerful man named Mr. Briggs, waved him over with a grin. "Got something for you, McAllister. Didn't think you were the letter-getting kind, but here it is, plain as day." John frowned as Briggs handed him a thick envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, feminine, delicate. He hadn't received a letter in years. Most people who once cared to write had either passed on or moved far away. His fingers felt clumsy as he broke the seal, curiosity tugging at his guarded heart. Inside was a letter written in elegant script. At first, the words confused him. The writer, a young woman named Clara Whitfield, thanked him for his sponsorship and expressed relief that her long journey from the East would soon end. She described her hopes of starting a new life with him, of building a family together, of being a wife in every sense of the word. The letter closed with warmth and sincerity, signed simply, "Your bride-to-be, Clara." John's heart nearly stopped. Bride-to-be? Sponsorship? He read the letter twice, then a third time, as though the words might change. It had to be a mistake. He had never written to any matchmaking agency, never sought a wife by mail, never sent for anyone. The very idea seemed absurd. He crumpled the paper in his fist, muttering under his breath. Damn fools must have mixed up the names. Not my doing. His instinct was to hand it back to Briggs and demand clarification, but the postmaster only shrugged. "Letter says she's coming, McAllister. Bound to be here on the next coach. Best you sort it out, then." The news rattled him all the way back to the ranch. His mind churned with questions. Who was this Clara Whitfield? Where had she come from? Why had someone at some matchmaking service paired her name with his? Most importantly, what would happen when she discovered she'd been sent to the wrong man? That night, sleep eluded him. He paced the floor of his cabin, the letter spread open on the table. The words seemed to glow in the lamplight, full of promise and innocence. She had written with such hope, such trust. And he, an isolated rancher who hadn't touched a woman in 15 years, was no one's dream. Part of him considered ignoring the matter altogether. Let her arrive, see the mistake, and find her way elsewhere. But another part of him, a part buried deep and long silenced, stirred uneasily. It wasn't just the thought of a woman arriving. It was the thought of a woman arriving for him, even if by mistake. By the time dawn came, John had convinced himself it would be nothing. The girl would arrive, he would explain, and she would leave. Life would return to its monotonous rhythm. But beneath that hard reasoning was a whisper he could not quite silence. The whisper that maybe, just maybe, fate had sent this letter for a reason. And so, with tension building and the promise of change hanging in the air, the stage was set. A woman from across the country was on her way to his lonely doorstep, bringing with her not only confusion, but the possibility of a life he had long since stopped believing in. The stagecoach rattled into town just past noon, its wheels grinding against the dry earth of the main street. Dust billowed in clouds, catching in the air as curious townsfolk paused to watch the new arrivals step down. In small western towns, the arrival of a coach was always an event, news from faraway places, parcels from the city, sometimes even new faces daring enough to start a life on the frontier. John McAllister stood at the edge of the crowd, his broad hat pulled low to shade his eyes. He hadn't planned to come, but something had driven him there, a restless urge perhaps, or the gnawing need to see for himself if the letter's promise was true. He told himself he only came to confirm the mistake, to set things right before some poor woman got her hopes dashed. But deep down, he knew curiosity had gotten the better of him. The door of the stagecoach swung open, and a young woman stepped down with careful grace. She wore a travel-worn dress, the hem dusty from miles of road, and clutched a small valise as though it carried everything she owned. Her face, though tired, shone with determination. Her eyes scanned the crowd, wide and searching, until they landed on him. "Mr. McAllister?" she asked softly, her voice trembling but hopeful. John's heart clenched. She was younger than he expected, perhaps mid-20s, with auburn hair pinned beneath a bonnet, and eyes the color of the summer sky. She looked nothing like the weary widows or desperate women he imagined would sign themselves into mail-order marriages. She looked alive, earnest, too good for the mistake that had brought her here. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the townsfolk watching. "Miss Whitfield, is it? There's been some sort of mix-up." Confusion crossed her features, then a flicker of fear. "But I came all this way. The agency said, 'You sent for me.'" The murmurs around them grew louder. Whispers of McAllister's bride rippled through the crowd. John felt the weight of their stares pressing against him. He hated gossip, hated the way people looked at him like some ghost of a man. And now here he stood with a young woman who thought she belonged to him. He wanted to set her straight then and there, but one look at her trembling hands stilled his tongue. She had no family waiting, no carriage to whisk her elsewhere. The stagecoach that had brought her was already rolling away in a haze of dust. This woman, mistake or not, had nowhere to go. "You best come with me," he muttered at last, his voice low. "We'll get this sorted." Her relief was palpable, though her eyes still held questions. She followed him through the gawking crowd, her small valise clutched tightly to her chest. When they reached his horse, he lifted her belongings onto the saddle and helped her mount behind him. For a man who hadn't touched a woman in 15 years, the brief brush of her hand against his sent a jolt through him, sharp and unwelcome. He ignored it, pressing his lips into a grim line. The ride back to the ranch was silent, save for the steady rhythm of hooves on hard-packed dirt. Clara, she had introduced herself properly as Clara Whitfield, glanced around at the wide-open land, her expression caught between awe and fear. John, for his part, wrestled with his own thoughts. It was only temporary, he told himself. She would stay the night, maybe a few days, until arrangements could be made. Then she'd move on, and his life would return to its quiet, lonely order. Yet even as he told himself this, a strange unease lingered. The house he had kept so empty for so long would now have another presence within it. A woman's voice, a woman's footsteps. He didn't know whether to dread it or welcome it. By the time they reached the ranch house, dusk had settled over the plains. John helped Clara down from the horse, his hand steady on her arm. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Hers full of uncertainty, his full of guarded restraint. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "We'll figure out what to do come morning." But even as he led her through the doorway, John sensed something stirring in the air. Something that whispered his carefully ordered life would never be the same again. Life under the same roof was never meant to be easy. From the very first night, John McAllister felt the disruption of Clara Whitfield's presence in his home. For 15 years, the house had echoed only with his footsteps, his voice, his silence. Now, there was the soft shuffle of her skirts across the floorboards, the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the sight of her small valise tucked neatly in the corner of the spare room. Everything felt strange, too strange, and John didn't know how to handle it. At supper, the awkwardness was thick. John sat at the head of the table, shoulders hunched, while Clara served stew she had made herself from the supplies in his pantry. He wasn't used to anyone cooking for him. The simple act of a woman ladling food into his bowl stirred memories of a life he'd buried long ago. He muttered thanks, but kept his eyes on the plate, eating in silence. Clara, on the other hand, tried to bridge the gap with polite conversation. "Your ranch is beautiful," she said softly. "The land stretches so far, it almost looks like the sky could swallow it whole." He gave a grunt in reply. Words did not come easily to him, especially not with a woman watching him across the table, her eyes full of quiet curiosity. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. John rose early as always, slipping out before Clara woke, thinking distance would keep things simple. He buried himself in chores, mending fences, riding the perimeter, fixing the broken gate he'd meant to repair for weeks. Yet when he returned home in the evenings, Clara had been busy too. She swept the floors, scrubbed the kitchen table until it gleamed, even aired out the heavy quilts. Once, he found her outside hanging laundry, the wind tugging at her bonnet, sunlight touching her auburn hair until it glowed like copper. He turned away quickly, scolding himself for noticing. Still, he could not ignore the difference her presence made. The cabin smelled of bread baking instead of dust. The hearth flickered more often, its warmth filling the space that had always felt cold. Even the sound of her humming while she worked, a simple, tuneless hum, seeped into the silence like water finding cracks in dry earth. And yet, the tension between them only grew sharper. John was a man unused to company, and every glance, every accidental touch unsettled him. He caught himself staring more than once, at the curve of her smile, the way her hands moved swiftly as she kneaded dough, the soft determination in her voice when she spoke. Each time he looked away, ashamed of how easily she rattled the walls he had built. Clara noticed his distance. Though she tried to mask her hurt, her eyes often lingered on him with unspoken questions. Why was he so cold? Why wouldn't he talk to her? One evening, after another meal eaten in silence, she finally asked, "Do you wish I hadn't come here?" John froze. The truth sat heavy on his tongue. He wanted to say yes. Life was easier, safer without her. But he also knew that wasn't the whole truth. The house no longer felt like a tomb. And that was because of her. Still, pride and fear held him back. "It was a mistake," he muttered. "You know that as well as I do." Her face fell, but she nodded, her dignity intact. "A mistake," she repeated quietly as though testing the word. Then she excused herself, retreating to her small room. That night, John lay awake longer than usual. He could hear her moving softly on the other side of the thin wall, could almost feel the warmth of her presence so close. For 15 years he had lived without the touch of a woman, without her nearness. And now, with Clara under his roof, the air itself seemed charged, carrying both the sweetness of possibility and the sharp edge of discomfort. Awkward tensions hung heavy between them, unspoken words, unacknowledged desires, and the fear of what would happen if either dared to cross the invisible line they both felt so strongly. Word traveled fast in small towns, and it didn't take long before the story of John McAllister's mail-order bride spread like wildfire across the prairie. By the next time John rode into town for supplies, whispers followed him from the general store to the blacksmith's. Men tipped their hats with sly grins. Women whispered behind their hands, and children giggled openly. Too young to understand the weight of gossip. There he goes. The old hermit finally took himself a wife. One man chuckled loud enough for John to hear. Poor girl, must have been desperate, another added. John's jaw tightened as he loaded flour and beans into his wagon. He wanted to shout that it was a mistake, that Clara Whitfield wasn't his bride, but he knew how useless it would be. In towns like these, truth mattered less than talk. Once a rumor rooted itself, it grew like wild thistle. Clara felt it too. When she ventured into town with him a week later, she could sense the curious eyes tracking her every move. Women looked her up and down, some with pity, others with disapproval. To them, she was either a victim who'd shackled herself to a lonely rancher or a schemer who had trapped him into marriage. Clara kept her chin high, but inside, shame and uncertainty churned. That evening, she confronted John as he unloaded supplies. "They all think I belong to you," she said, her voice tight. "That I came here to be your wife. Do you know what they call me?" John's back stiffened, but he didn't turn. "Doesn't matter what they call you. Folks always talk." "It matters to me," she pressed, stepping closer. "I have no family here, no reputation to shield me. If they think I'm your wife, then that's all I'll ever be in their eyes. And if I'm nothing at all, then I'm worse than invisible. I'm a woman alone with no one to speak for me." The weight of her words hit him harder than a hammer to the chest. He'd been alone so long he had forgotten what it meant to need protection. Not from wolves or storms, but from society itself. A woman traveling alone, living in a man's home without vows to bind them, carried the sharp sting of scandal. Clara hadn't just stumbled into his house. She had stumbled into a fire she couldn't escape without help. For the first time since her arrival, John truly looked at her. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes fierce, despite the tremor in her voice. She wasn't a fragile porcelain doll. She was a woman fighting for dignity in a place that gave her none. "I never asked you to stay," John said gruffly, though the words lacked conviction. "You're free to go whenever you like." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Go where, Mr. McAllister? Back to the east where I came from? I sold everything to pay for that journey. My father's gone, my stepmother remarried. There's nothing waiting for me there. If I leave this ranch, I have nowhere to go. Do you understand? Nowhere." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels in the wind. For a moment, John felt something stir deep inside him, an instinct he thought long dead. He had built walls around his heart, but Clara's words slipped through the cracks. He realized then that her presence wasn't just an inconvenience to his routine. It was a responsibility. Like it or not, Clara had tied her fate to his, even if by mistake. And if he sent her away, she would be lost. John exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the wagon until his knuckles whitened. "You can stay," he said at last, his voice rough but steady. "For now. You'll have shelter, food. I'll see to it no one bothers you." Clara nodded, relief flickering in her eyes, though pride kept her from thanking him. She simply turned back toward the house, her skirts brushing against the dry earth. For John, it was a turning point. Until now, he had told himself she was a temporary disruption. But the harsh realities of the world, its gossip, its dangers, its merciless judgment, had forced him to see the truth. Clara needed protection, and he was the only one who could give it. What he didn't yet admit, even to himself, was that a part of him wanted to. The first real test came sooner than either of them expected. The summer had been dry, the kind of season that cracked the earth and withered the grass until cattle grew lean and restless. John had seen dry years before, but this one was different. The water in the northern pasture had run low, and if the herd didn't get moved to the creek bed miles away, he'd lose half his stock. Normally, he would have handled it alone. He was used to managing everything with his own two hands. But with the herd scattered across wide ground and the fence line in need of quick repair, even John knew the task was too great for one man. He needed help, and the only person within reach was Clara. He almost didn't ask. Pride gnawed at him. What kind of man couldn't manage his own land? Yet when he saddled up at dawn and saw Clara already awake, braiding her hair and readying breakfast, the words slipped out. "I'll need an extra pair of hands today." Clara looked up from the skillet, her expression steady. "Tell me what to do." That was how she ended up on horseback, skirts hitched slightly for riding, following John out into the parched pasture. At first he worried she'd slow him down. She wasn't used to the rough terrain, the dust, or the way cattle surged when driven too hard. But to his surprise, Clara didn't falter. She rode with determination, guiding the stragglers back into line, her voice carrying clear commands. She was no ranch hand, but she was willing, and that made all the difference. When the herd spooked at a sudden clap of thunder from distant skies, Clara acted faster than John expected. She steered her horse into the panicked animals, cutting them off from scattering further. The sight of her, small against the massive beasts, yet holding firm, stirred something fierce in John's chest. He spurred his own horse forward, riding alongside her until the cattle settled once more. By the time the herd reached the creek bed, both of them were coated in dust and sweat, their muscles aching from the long hours. John dismounted to check the water supply, finding it low but enough to sustain the animals for a while longer. He turned to Clara, who was brushing dust from her skirt. Her cheeks flushed from exertion. "You did well," he said gruffly, surprising himself with the admission. She smiled faintly, though her eyes shone with pride. "You didn't think I could manage it." He hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Didn't reckon you'd stick it out." "I've had to stick things out before," she replied softly, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, John wondered what hardships she had endured before coming here. The question burned on his tongue, but he swallowed it, afraid of prying too deeply into her past. That night, back at the cabin, the air between them shifted. Clara prepared supper with quiet efficiency, but when she set the bowl in front of him, her hands lingered just slightly on the table. John noticed. He noticed everything, how her hair had slipped loose from its braid, how her shoulders sagged with fatigue, how her presence filled the room in a way that felt both unsettling and comforting. As they ate, silence hung between them, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind that had plagued their first meals together. Instead, it was an easier quiet, born of shared work, of mutual exhaustion, of respect that had begun to grow. Later, as John stepped outside to check the stars and the cooling breeze, he realized something he hadn't admitted to himself in years. Trust, fragile, hesitant, but real, was forming between them. She had proven herself not just capable, but loyal. She hadn't complained, hadn't faltered, hadn't run. For a man who had lived alone for 15 years, trusting no one but himself, it was no small thing. Clara had passed her first test, not in words but in action. And John knew, though he wouldn't yet say it aloud, that he no longer saw her as a burden or mistake. She was becoming something else entirely. The days after driving the cattle to the creek shifted something between John and Clara. It was subtle at first, like a soft wind changing direction, almost unnoticeable if one wasn't paying attention. But John noticed. He noticed how Clara no longer hovered at the edge of his world, unsure of her place. She moved through the house and across the ranch with quiet confidence, no longer asking permission at every turn. And he, to his own surprise, didn't mind. One evening, after a particularly long day repairing the barn roof, John returned to the cabin to find Clara sitting by the fire. She had mended one of his shirts, her slender fingers still working the needle through the fabric as lamplight glowed against her hair. It struck him then how long it had been since he'd come home to such a sight. 15 years of walking into a silent, empty house. And now here she was, humming softly, as if she had always belonged. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the swell of emotion rising in him. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, nodding at the shirt. Clara looked up, her smile small but warm. "I know, but I want to." Her words lingered. "I want to." John had almost forgotten what it meant for someone to want to care for him, not out of duty or necessity, but out of choice. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, staring into the fire. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the old, heavy silence. This one felt waiting. For a long time, John said nothing. Speaking about the past was something he avoided, a wound he never let anyone touch. But watching Clara's calm patience, something inside him broke loose. "My wife," he said suddenly, his voice low and rough. "She died 15 years ago. Fever took her. One day she was well, the next she was gone. After that, I stopped letting anyone close. Easier that way." Clara's hands stilled on the fabric, her gaze steady on him. She didn't interrupt, didn't press, just listened. That more than anything gave him the courage to go on. "I told myself the ranch was enough. That work could fill the emptiness. But it don't. Not really." His voice cracked at the edges, though he fought to keep it steady. "You live long enough in silence, it starts to feel like you're fading too." When he finally looked at Clara, expecting pity, he found none. Only understanding. Her blue eyes shimmered in the firelight, filled with a quiet strength. "I know something about loss," she said softly. "When my father died, my stepmother saw me as a burden. I was shipped off to relatives, passed from house to house. I learned to keep my head down, to expect nothing. Coming west was a risk, but I thought maybe there was a chance for a life of my own." Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away. "So no, Mr. McAllister, I don't pity you. I understand you. More than you think." The fire popped, filling the silence that followed. John felt something shift deep within him, a wall cracking, a door opening. For the first time in years, he had spoken aloud the grief he had carried alone, and Clara had not turned from it. Instead, she had met it with her own truth. That night, as he lay in bed, he could still hear the softness of her voice. He realized she wasn't just a stranger forced into his life by mistake. She was someone who saw him, not the stoic rancher, not the recluse the town gossiped about, but the man beneath all that. The turning point came not with a storm or danger, but with a letter. Clara found it tucked among the supplies brought in from town. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar, and when she unfolded the paper at the kitchen table, her heart gave a startled lurch. It was from the mail order agency, the very one that had mistakenly sent her to John's ranch in the first place. The words were polite, apologetic, but they cut deep. "We regret the mix-up. If you still wish, another match can be arranged in Denver. A home awaits you there." Clara folded the letter carefully, but her hands trembled. A choice stood before her. She had never asked to come here, to John's lonely stretch of land, yet in the weeks she had spent under his roof, she had begun to carve out something that felt dangerously close to belonging. But was it real? Or just a fragile illusion built on circumstance and need? That evening, she placed the letter on the table between them as John came in from the barn. His face, dusty and lined with fatigue, tightened when he saw the paper. He sat down slowly, his broad shoulders stiff, and read the lines. When he finished, he didn't look at her immediately. His thumb pressed hard against the edge of the page, as if he could grind it to dust. Finally, his eyes lifted, shadowed and uncertain. "So, you've got yourself an out." The words were blunt, but beneath them lay something else, fear. Clara heard it, though he tried to hide it. "I do," she admitted quietly. "Denver's not far. A proper match, a husband who wants me, a place where I'd be expected." John's jaw clenched, and for a moment he said nothing. Clara could feel the storm gathering behind his silence, the way he wrestled with things he didn't know how to put into words. "I won't keep you," he said finally, his voice low, almost rough. "You deserve more than this place, more than me." Clara's breath caught. She had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but not this quiet surrender. It hurt more than any harsh word. "You think I care about what I deserve?" she asked, her voice rising, trembling with emotion. "You think I want some stranger in Denver just because it's proper?" "John, I've lived my whole life being passed along like unwanted goods. For the first time, I chose to stay somewhere. With you." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. John stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "I don't know how to be what you'd need," he said finally. His voice cracked, betraying the weight of his own fear. "I don't know how to give more than hard work and silence. I don't know if I can." Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling but steady enough to rest on the table between them. "Then don't promise me the world. Don't pretend to be anything you're not. Just let me in. That's all I'm asking." The fire in her eyes, the certainty in her voice, it broke through the last of his walls. John reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single touch, that fragile bridge between loneliness and something new. The letter lay forgotten on the table. The choice had been made, not with pen and ink, but with courage, honesty, and the kind of trust that had taken root between them. For the first time in 15 years, John allowed himself to believe that maybe he wasn't destined to live and die alone. The morning after Clara's choice, the ranch felt different. The same sun rose over the hills, casting gold across the fields. But John noticed things he hadn't in years: the crispness of the air, the faint chirp of meadowlarks, the soft clatter of Clara moving about the kitchen. Life, he realized, hadn't changed overnight. He had. Clara emerged with breakfast, her hair loosely tied, her eyes calm but searching. John met her gaze across the table, and for once he didn't look away. The silence between them wasn't heavy, wasn't guarded. It was simply two people who had finally said the words they'd been holding back. As they ate, Clara spoke first. "I'll need to learn more about the herd, and the garden could use tending before winter. And if I'm to stay, we should think about the cabin, fixing the roof, maybe adding another room." John blinked at her, startled. For years, he had carried the weight of the ranch alone, every decision his and his alone. Now here she was, already speaking of we. The word warmed something deep inside him. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice gruff but softer than before. Clara smiled faintly. "I wouldn't be planning if I wasn't." The days that followed wove them together more tightly than either expected. Clara rose early, working beside John in the fields, learning the rhythms of ranch life with a determination that impressed him. She laughed when things went wrong, like when a stubborn calf refused to budge, or when she burned the bread after forgetting it in the oven. John found himself laughing, too, real, full laughter he hadn't heard in his own voice for years. Evenings became their quiet sanctuary. They shared stories by the fire, fragments of past sorrows and small hopes for the future. John spoke of the land, how he'd dreamed of turning the ranch into something lasting. Clara shared her longing for a place where she wasn't treated as a burden, but as a partner. Slowly, their lives intertwined, not by accident or obligation, but by choice. One night, under a sky thick with stars, John finally said the words that had been building in him. They stood by the corral, the air cool and sharp, their shoulders nearly touching. "I don't have much to give," he said quietly, "but I've got this land, and I've got what's left of me. If you'll have it, Clara, I'd like you to stay, not just as company, not just as help. As my wife." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining, not with surprise, but with certainty. She had seen the man beneath the silence, the one who carried grief and strength in equal measure. She reached for his hand, her fingers slipping into his. "Yes," she whispered, "I already chose you." It wasn't a grand moment with witnesses or ceremony. It was simple, honest, and real. For John, it was enough. For Clara, it was everything she had ever wanted. Weeks later, the townsfolk noticed the change. The reclusive rancher who had kept to himself for 15 long years now walked into town with a woman by his side. He didn't boast, didn't explain, but his softened eyes and the way he looked at her told the story better than words could. Back at the ranch, the once silent cabin filled with warmth, of laughter, of conversation, of shared work and dreams. The land was still hard, the work still demanding, but now the burden was shared. And in that sharing, something bloomed that had been missing for far too long. John McAllister was no longer a lonely rancher. Clara was no longer a mistake. Together, they were a beginning, one born of chance, tested by hardship and strengthened by choice. And in the quiet of the prairie nights, when John reached for Clara's hand beneath the stars, he knew with absolute certainty he had finally found home again.